का हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस सिर्फ 550 रुपए हर महीने से शुरू होता है।
Welcome back. You're watching NewsX with me, Malvika, and we're here as India is set to script a new chapter in its space journey today as Skyroot Aerospace prepares to launch Vikram-1, the country's first ever privately developed orbital rocket. The mission, named Agaman, will lift off from Satish Dhawan Space Center in Sriharikota at around 11:30 a.m. Of course, the launch marks a major milestone for India's private space sector and could open a new era of commercial space flight. I have with me Dr. Venkateshwar Sharma, former Deputy Director and Program Director, UR Rao Satellite Center of ISRO. Of course, sir, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We're of course here on the cusp of a major milestone for India, for its aerospace sector and for the private players who have very recently entered this sector as well. What do you feel in this moment? How important do you think this landmark is for the future of India's space program?
Good morning to you and the million viewers of NewsX. Of course, it is a great news that one of the startups, we started to launch the rocket in the space, now has graduated themselves to launch into the space, that is the orbital slot. Orbital slot is what? Is what we have to ask ourselves first. The space is about, the atmosphere is about 80 to 100 kilometers. Beyond that is what we call it as orbital slots. Okay, when the rocket goes beyond 100 kilometers and goes up to 150 to 450 kilometers, that is where the slot where the rocket will launch the satellite into those orbits, and the satellites will stay in that orbit at a particular speed depending upon which slot it is being launched. Even earlier launches, we would have seen that the rocket launches happened, but they were all within the atmosphere, that 80 to 100 kilometers orbit. Now this is the first time that a startup is launching into the beyond 150 kilometer orbit, is something which is really appreciable, and also which is something to be complimented. If you see the history of Indian space program, it started around 1962 in a very humble way, and in 1972 the first Orbital satellite was conceptualized, and 1975, in 3 years from 1970 to 1975, like a startup, ISRO started like a startup in 1972, and 1975 the first Orbital was launched successfully. And even today, if you see, there is no startup which has made a satellite within 3 years and put it into the orbit. That's how the ISRO had been developing. After that, ISRO slowly further graduated themselves to SLV, ASLV, PSLV, GSLV, Mark III, and heavy lift vehicle, and also now the cryogenic engine. This is how ISRO has graduated itself from very small, humble way to a giant organization in about 60 years. And present situation is that that not only ISRO, many industries, many startups, many players are getting into the space ecosystem. From 2010 on, you could see that there is a sea of change in the ecosystem of the Indian space program, and it is being encouraged to have many startups to come into the space and contribute. This is really very healthy situation, where we had only about 250 to 300 startups in 2010, 2012. Now we have more than 1,000 startups, and successfully working. More than 600, 700 startups are very successfully contributing into the space program, and this is a proud moment for this country to have developed, have created such an ecosystem for the industries and for the startups to work in the niche area, what is called as the space program, where Indian contribution today is only about 2% of the global market, and now this is expected that such an initiative and such a attitude would take Indian space program beyond 2%, and it should be aimed at 15 to 20% is what is being expected. Specifically speaking upon the Vikram-1 rocket, this is a 4-stage rocket, 3 solid stage and 1 liquid stage rocket, and it is likely to be taking off from Sriharikota at about 11:30 a.m. today. I think 2 days back, the clearance has been given by the standing committee board for launch of this rocket, and this is about 14.5 minutes journey into the space. And the first stage after ignition will work for about 1.5 minutes and take the satellite to about 20 to 30 kilometer orbit. Then the first stage will separate and the second stage will ignite, and then it will go on up to 3.5 minutes, and after that second stage separation will be complete, and the payload fairing will be separated, and third stage ignition will start. Third stage is also a solid stage and take the rocket up to about 6 to 7 minutes of journey, and after that the last stage is the liquid stage, which will ignite and take the payload, that is the satellite, into the remaining 14.2 minutes of its journey, and it is likely to be about 11:44.5 minutes the successful injection of the payload, namely the satellite is expected to be done. And I would wish a very best for the Skyroot, the first Indian organization, first Indian startup, first to do this type of activity, to take the payload into the orbital slot.
Absolutely, sir. And what we've seen Skyroot say is that this test flight is supposed to be foundational. Of course, it's the very first private orbital rocket that is to be launched. And with this particular mission, all they want to do currently is to, the data collection and to have this as a sort of foundational mission. How important do you think this mission is, and such missions are, for the future of further such flights? And what exactly do they expect to find with this, do you think?
First and foremost, encouragement is that a startup from the country is launching a rocket into the orbital slot is something which is very, very interesting, and also very motivational for many other startups which are working in the same field. And the first and the foremost aspect is that no other startup has done it, no other private institution has done it, and this they are attempting for the first time, and they should come out successful, is what is being looked at as a major milestone for Skyroot as well as for other startups. As far as the payload is concerned, it is just only for it has no specific user defined application, but it is mainly the demonstration of the stage one solid stage, which has to necessarily perform up to 1.5 to 2 minutes, and then the correction of the orbit has to happen. Then the stage 2 has to get ignited, that the stage 1 separation has to happen, this important stage, and the stage 2 ignition has to happen, and once the correction of the orbit happens, then the stage 2 will take the payload for another 1.5 to 2 minutes, and about 3.5 to 4 minutes journey. The second stage has to get detached, that is separation of the second stage is something very important, which every startup, every private organization, institution is looking at. They are all very critical stages of the rocket flight, and after that the payload fairing has to be separated, because once it is in about 4 minutes, it will be out of the Earth atmosphere. There is no friction, therefore it is safer to remove the payload fairing. That is what we call the payload fairing separation. That's another milestone which is expected to be very closely watched at, and at about 4 minutes the third stage ignition has to happen, and that has to function for nearly 5 to 6 minutes of the journey of the rocket. By about 8 minutes from the T0, 8 minutes to 9 minutes from the T0, the third stage has to get burnt out, and then it has to get separated, and the ignition of the last stage, that is the liquid stage, has to happen, and the remaining portion of 14.2 minutes of the entire journey has to be successfully completed. And the last stage is also what is looked at is the insertion of the satellite into the orbit, what we call it as the payload. That is also being looked at. If you see, every stage of this rocket is extremely critical, and space doesn't really pardon any type of mistakes or any let-ups. Therefore, it is important that the satellite is launched successfully and every stage performed properly, and the orbit, what is desired orbit of 400 kilometer plus is achieved, and that is what is being very closely looked into. And this experience would also percolate and also give confidence for other startups, and also the ecosystem will be extremely satisfied in terms of creating such a system in the country, so that the not just the ISRO, but the requirement of the entire country as well as the world can be met by many other institutions also, which is the right way of doing it. It is not just possible for a government organization to meet the demands and also meet the world demands, and the market is huge. Therefore, this is the first step forward in terms of achieving what is called as Atmanirbharta, which is expected to be in 2047. The present government dispatch has announced that the Atmanirbharta, this is a step forward, and I think this is very encouraging.
Interesting fact that we came across was that Vikram-1's launch comes exactly 46 years after India entered the League of Space-faring Nations with SLV-3, which was of course India's first experimental satellite launch vehicle by ISRO. And now today on the ISRO launch pad, the first ever private orbital rocket launch by Skyroot. How do you view this journey that we are witnessing with